John Lennon made the decision to leave the Beatles during the summer of 1969, as the Beatles were finishing up production of their last chronological album, Abbey Road, which would be released in September of '69, and after enjoying some success for the first time as a solo artist. The Plastic Ono Band's first single, Give Peace a Chance, was released in July of '69 as well. In the early part of John Lennon's career working with his wife, Yoko Ono, he would enjoy success both working with Yoko and as a solo artist, and would also pursue various collaborations with some famous friends, including his Beatles bandmate Ringo Starr, Elton John, Harry Nilsson, and David Bowie. But one of Lennon's first collaborations was a rather infamous one. It took place with Frank Zappa on the stage of the Fillmore East on June the 6th, 1971. This collaboration ended with veiled allegations of copyright theft and of breach of promise. In this episode, I'm going to do my best to get down to the bottom of all that. John Lennon's collaboration with Frank Zappa was a rather spur-of-the-moment one. Frank Zappa was on tour in mid-1971 and had 2 nights, 4 shows in all, scheduled at the Fillmore East. Lennon was advised, some say, by Zappa's and Lennon's mutual friend Andy Warhol, that Frank Zappa was in town. And Lennon, who was a casual fan of some of Zappa's music with the Mothers of Invention, decided that he wanted to meet Zappa. Zappa tells the story in an interview that he granted MTV in the early 1980s that John Lennon, along with a reporter from the Village Voice, arrived at his hotel room in Greenwich Village at about 2 p.m. in the afternoon of June the 6th. Zappa had played his first 2 of the 4 scheduled shows at the Fillmore East the night before, and at 2 p.m. apparently was just getting out of bed. But Zappa nevertheless invited Lennon and the reporter into his hotel room. They chatted. One thing led to another, and Zappa evidently invited John Lennon and Yoko Ono to appear with him on stage at the Fillmore for an encore. Zappa had a mobile recording truck at the Fillmore for these shows with the intention of releasing a live album of the event, his first proper live album. Zappa had released live material before on several of his albums, but this would be the first live album that he would dedicate to the work of a single band on a single tour. Lennon asked Zappa if he could get a copy of the multi-track tapes from the show. Zappa agreed, with the provision that both Zappa and John and Yoko would be allowed to use the tapes as each saw fit. Frank Zappa would quickly come to market with the live recording he made at the Fillmore over his time there in June of 1971. His album, The Mothers, Fillmore East, June 1971, was the result. John Lennon would not go to market with any of the music from his appearance with Zappa until about 9 months or so later, when John and Yoko released their album, Sometime in New York City. Sometime in New York City was problematic for Zappa upon his seeing this album release, for several reasons. The first was that the liner notes for Sometime in New York City that referenced the Fillmore show made a direct copy of the artwork from the Mothers' June 1971 album. The artwork for Zappa's album was intended to be a parody of a bootleg album, which were becoming more and more commonplace in the early 1970s. But I would imagine that if Lennon used the artwork from the album, which Zappa commissioned his art director Cal Schenkel to create, that it would not only annoy Zappa, but that it would have annoyed his label Warner Reprise Records as well. It didn't stop there, though. Lennon included on Sometime in New York City an edited version of his entire appearance with Frank Zappa and the Mothers at the Fillmore. The first of these songs was Lennon covering a song that he used to play with the Beatles going back to the Cavern days. Their cover of a song by the Olympics from 1958 called Well, Baby Please Don't Go. The last two songs from the set were obvious improvisations from the stage. These are the songs Scumbag and Awe, with the latter being an improvisation by Yoko Ono. And then there was the song that caused the big problem for Zappa, the song Jam Rag. Jam Rag was treated on Sometime in New York City, as far as its accreditation, as an improvisation by John and Yoko. However, Jam Rag was not an improv. The song begins with a very obvious attempt of Frank Zappa's keyboard player, Ian Underwood, trying to take the band into a song that was a typical encore for the Mothers in this time frame, Zappa's song King Kong. King Kong obviously was a Zappa composition. It had been recorded by Zappa several times in the past, most notably on his Uncle Meat album, where he devotes an entire side to various interpretations of the composition. And it had been covered by other artists as well. In particular, Zappa participated in a recording that Jean-Luc Ponty did of the song in 1970, which some people refer to as the definitive version of the song in the studio. On top of all of that, there was one last problem, which was that when Zappa began work to consider inclusion of these songs in a Zappa Mothers album, he was advised by his lawyers that he could not. Between the potential theft of copyright and breach of Lennon's promise, you can see that Zappa was rather irritated by this entire affair. It even gets better. It turns out that the very first recording of King Kong was one that Zappa had released in 1967 through John Lennon's record company, EMI Records. The story there is an interesting sidebar. The first version of King Kong that was committed to record appeared on Frank Zappa's album Lumpy Gravy, released officially by MGM Verve Records in 1968. But as I'm sure most Zappa fans watching this know, the song was not initially recorded for MGM Verve. It was recorded for Capitol Records. Frank Zappa had made a deal with Capitol through one of Capitol's staff producers, Nick Vinay, to produce an orchestral version of some of his songs that he had not yet recorded with the Mothers of Invention. Zappa's interpretation of his record contract with MGM Verve was that while he was an exclusive performer on MGM Verve Records, that he had the right to pursue other types of musical endeavors, provided that he did not perform himself. And he viewed that providing music and conducting an orchestra on a recording for EMI Capitol was not in breach of that. Zappa probably stretched that interpretation a little bit too far, as it turned out, as several of the members of the Mothers of Invention of that time frame, including Roy Estrada and Bunk Gardner, appeared on Lumpy Gravy. But nevertheless, Zappa went ahead with working with Vinay to produce the album. And they got so far as to producing acetates of the platters for an LP version of the album. And there were some copies of the album that even appeared in the marketplace on the short-lived 4-track playtape format. MGM ultimately put a stop to Capitol's release of Lumpy Gravy and claimed the tapes for their own, with Zappa then reworking the project to release it on the MGM Verve label. But all of that to say, King Kong does appear on the Capitol version of Lumpy Gravy, albeit under a different title. The song on Capitol's version of Lumpy Gravy is called Foamy Soaky after a children's bath toy of the time. Given all this information around the use of King Kong, it would have been very easy for Zappa to, in court, claim credit for the song and really embarrass both John Lennon and EMI Records. He chose not to. He, by the time of his interview with MTV in the early 80s, had not taken any action at that point, and in fact would not take any action for quite some time. The big question there, of course, is why didn't he? Certainly the facts and the law were on his side here. And that is true. However, I suspect that there were two other considerations that came to mind that stopped Zappa from taking action here. The first was management to public opinion. Even though the Beatles were gone, John Lennon was still a star in the public's eyes. And I'm sure that Zappa's manager, Herb Cohn, and his legal team probably envisioned that if Zappa had gone to court to claim his copyright on Jamrag, that they envisioned the headlines in Rolling Stone as reading, "Zappa sues Lennon," probably with a story to go with it, in essence saying, "How dare that upstart go after our beloved John." The second reason, I suspect, why Zappa didn't pursue legal action here was a practical one. Some Time in New York City was a relative failure compared to John and Yoko's other albums of this time frame. The album only got as high as the top 50 on the Billboard album charts and did not stay on the album charts for long. There were very few songs on the album that radio found worthy to play, and a couple of them were of a nature that radio all but banned them. Zappa may have come to the conclusion that even if he could have gotten the rights to claim royalties on a song from the album, that his costs for pursuing the legal action might have been greater than the money he would have recouped from the royalties after the fact. As for the promise of Zappa being able to use the material from the Fillmore encores himself in an album, I would dare say that that was an issue not between Zappa and John Lennon, but between Zappa and EMI Records. In June 1971, when Zappa and Lennon made their gentleman's agreement to share the music on the tapes, they probably were within their rights to do that legally. But in October of 1971, the laws changed dramatically in the United States around phonographic copyright because of the phenomenon of bootlegging. Prior to this date, in the United States, most copyrights for music concentrated on the copywriting of the song itself, making sure that someone writing a new song couldn't claim that your melody was now part of his song without proper compensation. By the early 70s, recording technology had become good enough and portable enough where it was fairly easy to sneak a cassette machine into a show to make an audience recording, or for an unscrupulous sound person to make a copy off of the soundboard and market that as a bootleg album. By 1971, the major labels had lobbied fiercely in Washington to make sure that there was proper statutes on the books in U.S. federal law to prevent bootlegging. There were such laws going back as early as 1961, apparently, in the global marketplace, but not in the U.S. And so this left a fairly large legal loophole for the bootleggers to take advantage of. This changed in October 1971 with the concept of phonographic copyright. The phonographic copyright is noted on all albums made after October 1971 in the U.S. through the letter P with a circle around it, appearing on record labels, on CDs, and on other media on which recorded music is physically presented. I'm sure that EMI's stance on Zappa's releasing anything from the Fillmore set would have been that since Lennon had released it first, in June of 1972, on Sometime in New York City, that EMI Records, who were the parent company of Apple Records, for whom John and Yoko still recorded at that time, that the phonographic copyright remained with EMI. And that even though John and Yoko had made an agreement with Zappa that Zappa could share the tapes, and indeed Zappa funded the creation of the tapes, that they were now off limits to him. Ultimately, Zappa would release his version of these tapes to the public a number of years later. He did this on his double CD set, Playground Psychotics, released in 1992. I suspect that Zappa's doing this at this particular time was for several reasons. The first was that by 1992, Frank Zappa knew that he was dying. He had been diagnosed a year or so before with prostate cancer and was told that he did not have a very long time left to live. And he may have wanted this music, or his version of this music anyway, to be in the public's hands during his lifetime. The second thing that played towards Zappa's releasing the music at this time was that by 1992, Frank Zappa had full control of his catalog and released it to the public through his company, Barking Pumpkin Records. In 1992, Barking Pumpkin was distributed in North America by EMI. And so Zappa may have seen that this was a good time to discuss this matter with the label and put it to bed. The version of the Fillmore show included on Playground Psychotics includes Well, the Olympic song from the Lennon set, along with Scumbag and Awe, which is edited down and retitled by Frank Zappa as A Small Eternity with Yoko Ono. Talk about a dig. Jam Rag, the offending track that breached Zappa's copyright, is re-edited. It's presented as two selections on Playground Psychotics, one called Say Please and the other called Awk. The total length of those two tracks together is about 4 minutes, as opposed to the length of Jam Rag, which is about 5.5. The difference in length being that Zappa took it upon himself to completely edit out the reference to the King Kong melody that appeared in Jam Rag. Some years later, when EMI went to market with a remastered version of Sometime in New York City, there was what appeared to be additional evidence that some settlement between the Zappa Family Trust, at this time now being run by Frank Zappa's widow Gail, and Yoko Ono and her legal representation had been reached. On versions of Sometime in New York City that have been released since 2006, only the song Well, Baby Please Don't Go, the Olympics tune, appears on the album from the Mothers set from the Fillmore. The other songs with Frank Zappa and the Mothers have been excised completely. The music industry can be a very, very nasty business indeed. Anyway, that's all for this episode. I hope you enjoyed it, as always. If you have any questions or comments, by all means, feel free to leave them here. If you liked the episode, of course, click on like. If you haven't subscribed to Propaganda yet, of course, please do that as well. We will be back with you again very soon. Take good care. Bye-bye.